This is Secrets of the Better Halves, and this is your out of context soundbite.
When I need bucking up, I don't need to cry. I need someone to buck me up and to say, okay, this is hard, but it was harder for this leader or this leader. Come on, this is what you're here for.
I'm Debbie Phillips.
I'm Dan Mulhern.
And I'm Marcos Kounalakis. Welcome to Secrets of the Better Halves, the podcast where partners explore how they handle the power and the pressure of their dynamic relationships. Our out of context soundbite is from today's episode with U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. She won't be talking to us today about nuclear energy or fusion, but rather about being a better half to our partner, Dan.
I'm thrilled, a little nervous, but grateful as always.
I am so excited about today because this is a woman who has been an incredible role model to me in my life.
Jen, good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be on.
We often talk about people in high-profile positions and the challenges of being a spouse, being a number one, number two. Dan, I'm sure you'll find this interesting because you are not going to be participating.
I'm doing this podcast to talk, Marcos. I don't get to talk.
We'll talk to you afterwards. How's that? So let's invite in Jennifer Granholm, Madam Secretary. Great to see you.
You bet. It's fun to be on with you all about such unusual topics that I don't normally get to talk about.
Well, it is unusual, because oftentimes you're faced with your daily routine and work, and it is very important. I mean, you're currently the Energy Secretary at a time when we're facing this existential crisis of climate. But we want to talk about sort of how it works both professionally and personally. So when you were governor, your husband, Dan Mulhern, our partner, was called the first gentleman. And I have a two-part question. First, how do you introduce Dan now? There is no sort of title for the spouse of a cabinet secretary. And secondly, is there a role that a cabinet secretary's spouse should or could play?
Super interesting. I haven't even thought about that. We are bi-coastal, so he's not here at a lot of events, although when he is here, he's, my husband. That's how he's introduced. It's not as though he's like energy secretary, gentleman, or whatever it would be. And, do they have a role? For example, we were just at the National Governors Association has an annual dinner at the White House where all the governors come in and the cabinet and their spouses. If they have a spouse, if they have a significant other, they may even bring they have a plus one. I'll just say that. And Dan was my plus one. Normally in these things, you sit like across the table from one another and you're sort of hosting the table and paying attention to the other guests. And this go round, we were actually seated next to one another, which was kind of nice. But Dan is so easy as a spouse in a professional capacity. Like, I just never have to worry about him because he's off doing his own thing, talking to people. Even though he's an introvert, in these kind of settings, he's really great about bringing people out and asking questions of them and very gregarious in many ways. So he's an easy spouse to have at these things.
Jen, take us back to when you first laid eyes on Dan. Where were you and what did you think?
It was like 38 years ago. We were both students at Harvard Law School, but we met at Counter M of People Express Airlines.
Fly your business the way you run it. Smart. People Express to New York.
I was coming back from California, waiting for my connecting flight. He was coming back from Michigan, waiting for his connecting flight. I was a first-year law student. He was a second-year law student. I was sitting on the ground waiting for our gate to be called. I was doing my homework, and I heard this voice over my head, Harvard Law School, Harvard Law School. And I look up, and he's standing over me, but talking to somebody else. And I looked up, and I said, "You go to Harvard Law School?" So that was our first encounter. We sat next to each other on the plane, and he courted me in a very persistent manner. For example, he would press flowers between wax paper and put them in the mailbox in what is known as the Harkness Commons, which is where all of the students gathered their mail. He was totally romantic, wrote me poems. I was at that time one of the leaders of a student protest movement against Harvard's investments in countries that did business in South Africa. And so he came to the protest and brought me ice cream, and he was very intentional. And so we met on, I want to say April 1st, April Fool's Day. And then we were engaged like 6 weeks later. And then we were married within a year. I know it's similar. You guys, Marcos had a very quick courtship as well, you and Eleni. And we did as well. You know, as my mother used to say, when it's right, you know it.
It's exactly right. Ours was an 8-week courtship, and it was fantastic.
So he was romantic, but did you think of him like, this is a good life partner?
Yeah, I did. You know, I was 27, 28, had done a lot of dating. So the first time we went on a date, I brought a list of questions that I just wanted to get through to see if it's worth pursuing, because I don't want to waste my time if this is not going to work. So I wanted to make sure that, for example, he comes from a wonderful, loving, but very large Irish Catholic family. And while I wanted to have kids, I didn't want to have 8 of them. So I wanted to make sure that we were on the same page. It was very important to me that he was a Democrat. It was very important to me, all sorts of things that we share values on. So he passed the test and we moved on from there. And I wanted to know, can he cry? I wanted somebody who had some depth and was not afraid of expressing emotion. For me, that was important.
When did he cry?
He expresses his emotions a lot. And it's one of the beautiful things about him is he is not afraid to cry. He's not afraid to express how he is feeling internally. It's very healthy, in my view.
What does that do for you when he's able to express himself so deeply?
Honestly, he models the way. I am not that way. We're sort of in the opposites attract camp in the sense that nobody in my family cried. You're not supposed to be crying, you know, tough it out, power through, all of that. And I wanted to open up, you know, I wanted to know somebody who was not as bottled up perhaps as what my experience and I have been, although it's always a challenge for me because I still am very contained, I'll just say. But he has been a tremendous life partner in that sense that he has been able to expand my horizons and my depth of emotion because it's okay with him. If I'm frustrated, he creates a welcoming space for me to express that. If I'm sad, it's very beautiful.
Jen, I can't imagine in the intensity of your work exactly how powerful and important this is. And so it makes me think about you coming home from travels, like with a heavy suitcase and clothes in it and so much on your mind. Is there a way that Dan greets you or that you want to be greeted that you can then just relax into his strength and into his emotion?
Obviously, since we are in separate places right now, we talk every night by phone. And so we have a set time if we can. He has a teaching schedule that makes it a little bit tough to juggle, but we talk every night. When I'm there, when I was governor, for example, knowing that he was there not just as an emotional sounding board, but as a sounding board from all other professional point of view as well. I mean, he's a great partner in both senses of the word. Normally, as he would note, when I need bucking up, I don't need to cry. I need someone to buck me up and to say, okay, yeah, this is hard, but it was harder for this leader or this leader. Come on, this is what you're here for. For me, that is a huge gift because he knows what I want. For him, it would be different. What he would need would be a different sort of bucking up. But it's great because we have learned each other's needs, and he's been so entirely responsive to creating a response that wouldn't be a response that he would crave.
Right, which is the strength of better halves.
So, Jennifer, Dan and I spoke extensively about the night of Hillary Clinton's loss, and we were on the rooftop in New York City.
Upset victory, Donald J. Trump will become the 45th president of the United States, defeating Hillary Clinton in a campaign unlike anything.
And Dan, in fact, talked about knowing what you needed, whether it was bucking up, as you say, or, as he put it that night, he gave you the space that you needed to grok what had just happened.
For me, there was kind of a helplessness and a hopelessness of, oh my God, my best friend's getting broken, and there's nothing I can do, just but be here.
This enormous loss that was unexpected and certainly was going to dictate in some ways your next moves, both personally and professionally and as a family. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's another example of him intuiting what's good for me, but also he was grieving too. I mean, it was really a sense of grief that we were experiencing, not for us personally, but for the nation. I mean, I couldn't fathom what had happened and what we were going to be experiencing. And yes, he, in fact, I think we got a bottle of wine and talked, and he did give me the space to feel as angry and aggrieved as I felt, having worked so hard to make it happen. But it wasn't just about me. It was about the enormity of the situation. But yeah, he's an amazing partner in that he can really intuit and sense what is necessary in the moment, given who I am.
Jen, when you were in the hotel room with Dan, he was giving you your space. Was there anything that he needed from you that you were intuiting?
What I remember is that he knew how important this was because I had been working so hard on the transition. It wasn't about him. He didn't ask for anything. He just wanted to be there and helpful for me.
So maybe this is a good moment to sort of look back, because there's an arc to this role of being a better half. There are times when you first meet, as you talked about your time at Harvard, but then you go into a family life as well as your early professional life in state government, and you had small kids. Regarding the role that one plays, you're running a state. How does then the division of labor happen, and how does he play that role, and how do you manage to balance out that role once you've got such a high visibility and important public position?
It is really such a suck in terms of your time, your energy, your emotion, your focus. And yet you have this really important other piece of life, which is your family, that is a huge suck too. So having an agreement in advance about how things are going to operate, I think is, even if it's a tacit agreement, how things are going to operate is just really important. So we had a whole conversation about this because I had been Attorney General, and we went through the same sort of conversation. Our kids were young. We had a 10-month-old baby. And I was like, there is no way we're going to be able to do this. This running for Attorney General. And Dan was like, it's okay. I got the kids. We didn't know what the hell we were doing. It's safe to say. And I think when he was so encouraging about, a window or door opens, you go through it, I got this. I'm sure he didn't realize at that time what that was going to mean, but he was just all in on supporting me. So that played out through not just Attorney General, but for governor as well. He held the lane of being the primary parent. And for him, as somebody who grew up in Michigan, I married Michigan. I grew up in California. So I moved to Michigan to be with him and to support him. Never thought I was going to run for office. I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. And the opportunity to run for Attorney General, I was asked to run by some of the party leaders. And I was like, this is not what I was signing up for. But it was something that he was signing up for, meaning that when he was growing up, he wanted to be Pope or president. And I often joke he didn't become Pope or president, but he did become a saint for marrying me. He took on all of this stuff that, he did not grow up wishing to be first gentleman. I can tell you that. And so for him, and this is a really interesting and important part of his journey too, this is growing up in the 60s and 70s, guys had a role. And, I'm glad those roles are no longer confined to one's plumbing as they have been. But it does require a partnership that allows for negotiation. I often say that, the LGBTQ plus community has almost a better path because they can negotiate without reference to historical gender norms. They can negotiate the lanes of that relationship without having to be saddled by, I'm expected to do this or whatever. So it's harder for our generation. I'm 64, and it's harder for those in our generation not to bust out of those norms. And I know that was a challenge for Dan, but he did it. And he was amazing at it, and an amazing father, and certainly an amazing spouse. And he did a whole bunch of other things than what he thought he was going to be doing in life. But this is one of the reasons why I'm so utterly grateful to have a spouse like him.
So, Jennifer, it's so interesting that you mentioned that, because in the trailer for this program, Dan very specifically says,
I always thought I would be in that role, and she was.
And so your comment about Pope or president is something that he still recognizes was maybe an unfulfilled plan of his, and something that he's still dealing with. How does that work with you?
Yeah, it's hard. I wish that we all could have our cake and eat it too. I wish that he could have been able to achieve what he wanted. And I feel badly about it. I still feel badly about it. I do think that he has found just a fantastic role in being able to teach. He's gotten all of these awards as a professor, teaching massive classes. And so he's able to communicate in the way that he does so well, and he's able to share his thoughts and be a thought leader in the way that he does so well. So I take some comfort in his success. But I know it's an unfulfilled wish, and that lack of fulfillment is probably part of our perpetual issues as a couple.
How would you describe that in terms of perpetual issue? Does this come up all the time, or some of the time, or is it tacit?
Yeah, I mean, I think he would say that he's moved. It's not like something that's holding us back as a couple now. I mean, he's done his own inner work on that. But it's an issue that doesn't just go away for us. It is an issue that has to be addressed on a regular basis, whether it's him in therapy or in talks and discussions between us. I kind of wish he were speaking, because I'd love to hear how he reacts to this. Can I invite him in?
Yes, you can.
Wow, Jen, it's so strange to be doing this in this public way and to be still and quiet. It strikes me as such a gift we all should have, to be able to just hear our spouse talk about the marriage and us. And the thing that jumps out at me is I am so not unfulfilled at this point in my life. So let me be clear, there were lots and lots of really hard moments, which, by the way, every first lady knows. When somebody comes up and they talk to you as the first gentleman or the first lady, but they're really just trying to get to your spouse. So there's a diminishment that happens all the time that women have experienced for decades, centuries. So it's very hard to play my little violin for myself in that regard. You make choices and you make compromises. But it was hard. And for the human side of me, which sometimes I kind of transcend, and I'm a pretty good guy, it still is hard. As somebody who's had a great business, but who's had to hustle all the time, one of the things that sticks is most people who aren't in politics, the spouse and the partner can help each other. But I can't get anything from government. Like you remember, when you became governor, my business was completely wiped out because my clients were your taxpayers, were your citizens. And I didn't want you to look compromised because people would have tried to play that against you. So I did give up a lot, and it was hard. But I just want to say, part of growing up and staying in a long relationship, I think, is you learn who you are. And I can say with 100% certainty, you are a better executive than I ever could have been. And I don't mean that in a demeaning way toward myself. I have strengths, and thank you for noticing some, but they're not your strengths. So I don't feel unfulfilled. And you've been gracious in letting me celebrate victories. You brought me in as a volunteer to do the work that I know how to do, building great organizations at the state of Michigan. You and I mentored kids, and our children became mentors to children. And we built Habitat homes together. I mean, there was so much us in it that unfulfilled. I'm sorry I hadn't disabused you of that I don't feel regret. I don't feel sad. I don't feel like I wished I would have done that. I feel like we were blessed. You were called to be in that position, literally by human beings who called you out and said, run. And I think called by a higher power, and God bless the higher power.
Jen, I can't even imagine how busy your life is. We know Dan's life is busy. You're on separate coasts. What are the ways you are working to stay close together?
Well, definitely making sure that we are on each other's calendar for a daily call. I mean, we have to touch base every day. It's like oxygen. You just have to do it. On Saturday mornings, we have a breakfast that we schedule every week, and we are really good about that, whether we're together or apart. We'll maybe eat over Zoom, but it gives us more extended period of time to talk through the bigger issues. We've been reading the Gottman book together. Even though we've been together for so many years, it is really important to sharpen the saw, as they say, to refresh what's important for keeping lasting relationships. We don't pretend to have all the answers. We just work at it really hard. And of course, we're also strategizing ways to be together on weekends. So for example, if I am, in Seattle for an event that ends on a Friday, I will pay myself to extend my hotel room and invite Dan to fly up so that we can have a weekend together. So we're trying to be more intentional about things like that as well.
Thank you both for being so open about all these things. But can I go back to the question of the arc of the family? Because when you mentioned earlier how you did your division of labor, that Dan became the primary family member who was in charge of maybe dentist appointments and PTA meetings, your kids are now fully grown. And so the responsibilities and the expectations from those children are different. And so how does that relationship now translate to your current roles and your bicoastal living arrangement?
Well, let me just say that he's not been very good about scheduling dentist's appointments and stuff like that. That's not, when I say the primary parent, we look to the Myers-Briggs categories of personalities all the time, because it's been very helpful for us, because I am what is known as an ENTJ. I'm an extroverted, intuitive thinker, finisher. I'm like the person that you go to if you want to get something done. And Dan is the person you go to if you want to be fulfilled. He could stare for hours at a baby. He would play the guitar to the kids. He thoroughly enjoys that. We have this in our family. We've joked about what we'd want our superpower to be. And his superpower would be if he's outside and he sees a baby in a mother's arms, that the baby, with the mother's permission, would be able to float to him so that he could hold the baby. If you put our two characteristics next to one another and you wanted somebody to raise your children, you would pick Dan. I mean, I would get them to school and I would get them their dentist, but he would fill their souls. And that, to me, was a great division of labor. So that extends into adulthood as well. So I'm here in Washington, D.C. I live with our second child, Cecilia, and her husband and our grandchild. I live in the basement. I'm here in the basement as I'm doing this, and they're upstairs. I can hear little Dylan pit, pat, running across the floor. And then our third child, Jack, also lives upstairs. So I live with them, and we are together all the time, which is awesome. And I know Dan is jealous that we're together all the time. But then in California, our oldest, Rin, lives next door to him. So we are still very close as a family, very tight with one another, our bonds are really strong. As adults, it has been my love, my hope, my dream that grandkids would be around us and that we would be able to have our adult children nearby. Right now, it's pretty good.
If your relationship was a carnival ride, think if you go to the carnival, there's the Tilt-A-Whirl, there's the roller coaster, there's the scrambler, the bumper cars. What would you say your relationship is? It's
not a roller coaster. We've been solid. So I would probably say it would be more like the Ferris wheel. It's got its ups, it's got its downs, but it's steady. We have had a steady, grounded love with its ups and its downs.
Eleni and I often call it the log ride because it's fast and thrilling, but not terribly dangerous. And
you get wet sometimes.
and you get wet a lot, yeah.
That's good. I like the log ride. Maybe I'll change it. I'm so curious because Marcos is in the same position. And I'm sure you guys have probably talked about it, so maybe it's just me being curious as a human being, but how do you guys navigate those issues, Marcos, you with all the talents that you have, and Eleni with all the talents that she has, and the traditional sort of roles, et cetera? How has it been for you guys?
Eleni and I may have different answers. We'll have Eleni in a future episode, so she'll give her response to this. But here's how I see it. Like you and Dan having so much in common when you were in state government, because he was a political consultant, he understood state politics, he certainly understood Michigan. There was probably an awful lot for you to talk about all the time when you were in that role. And he had this identified role as first gentleman. The same was true for Eleni and me when she was ambassador to Hungary. I'm a foreign affairs guy, and I know this stuff inside and out. And I even knew the country quite well because I covered the revolutions of Eastern Europe and then moved to the Soviet Union. So the region was familiar, the politics and the role was familiar. Fast forward to her current role as lieutenant governor of the state of California. And I have to admit that I don't know a whole lot about state government. I feel like I'm sometimes unable to support what it is she does, or sometimes even understand what it is she does on a daily basis. So the thing that's changed has been that we don't often share the same vocabulary now professionally for me to be able to support her. The good news is the governor has appointed her head of international trade and relations. And so there is a role that I can now perform that is supportive and complementary to what it is she does. But that's exactly right. And that's what I was hinting at, which is there's this arc of how the relationship changes both personally and professionally. And so in the process, she's now incorporating more international stuff, and I'm learning a whole bunch of state things. And so we're both growing and the relationship is evolving.
There's such a parallel here because you're right. I mean, when I was governor, Dan grew up in Michigan. He was political. He knows all that stuff. Now, as energy secretary, that's not necessarily his area of expertise. And so it's a different conversation, but it's huge for learning. It's a huge door opener for curious folks. I mean, a lot of his students care about climate change, and he cares about climate change and all of that. He's a smart person. But, there's a lot of technical stuff associated with clean hydrogen and transmission and all of that he may not be, as comfortable with. But it's a great opportunity for growth.
Jen, thank you. You have just provided such a full view of what your life has been like with Dan. This has been so inspiring. And you've lived such a great life. And so as you think about post-public service in your life, I'd love you to paint a picture of what do you see as your life with Dan as a better half in the future when your life is much more relaxed and open and maybe there's a lot more free space?
You're talking about in retirement.
I never use that word.
We're not going to retire, either of us, but I can imagine slowing down. Family is everything for us. And so I want my family to be nearby or at least accessible. I want to see my grandchildren. I hope I have a few of them. But I also want to, before all of this falderall happened, I used to love to garden. I want to get my hands in the dirt. I want Dan and I to be able to take some cooking lessons because I don't know how to cook at all. And it would be so nice to be able to make a meal together and enjoy it. I want to do some pottery. It would be so fun to do that with Dan. So I can imagine building stuff together. He jokes, I joke that I want to be able to get some carpentry stuff, and he's going to roll his eyes because he's always wanted a carpentry bench and a saw. So I can imagine us doing stuff like that, in addition to continuing to serve in some way, shape, or form, and perhaps serving together in whatever that is, in a volunteer capacity somewhere.
Beautiful.
Sounds great, Jen. Let's do it. Hadn't thought about that.
Sooner than later, right?
Not tomorrow, but...
Right.
So, Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. Jen, thank you for being here today.
Oh, you bet, Marcos. Debbie, thank you so much, babe. Great to see you. And I'll talk to you later, hon.
Wink, wink, nod, nod.
But so great to be on, you guys. Thanks so much. I hope it was good.
Jen, you're great. This is wonderful.
And we hope you have a good run this afternoon when you're out there in Washington, D.C.
I'm going.
Thank you so much for being so open and for taking the time to be with us.
You bet. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Jen.
So the conversation clearly doesn't end here because we're going to our after show where we're going to let Dan out of his isolation booth to share his thoughts and how he feels about hearing his spouse talk about their relationship and the challenges and the successes of how they manage life together, both professionally and personally. So join us for the after show where we all exhale and share our thoughts. And you can find it in your podcast feed right now. So I'll see you there.
We hope you enjoyed Secrets of the Better Halves. We invite you to go to Apple Podcasts and leave an honest 5-star rating and write a positive review. On Spotify, click the 3 dots and rate the show. It'll help more people like you find us. And wherever you're listening, click the follow button so you never miss an episode.